exile, suspicion, and the bitter cost of loyalty. On May the 8th, 1945, the streets of London pulsed with life. Union Jacks fluttered from windows, champagne corks popped in rash defiance, and strangers danced in Trafalgar Square. Across the nation, church bells rang and people wept with relief. Victory in Europe. The war was over. Before we get started, if you want to support the channel and find all my links in one place, just scan the QR code on screen. It'll take you to Patreon, my social media, my books, everything's there. Now don't worry if you miss the code now, I'll show it again at the end of the video. So thanks for your support. Now, let's get into this week's story. At the heart of the celebration stood Buckingham Palace, draped in sunlight and roaring approval. On the famous balcony, King George VI emerged with Queen Elizabeth, composed and regal despite all they had endured. Beside them, the young Princess Elizabeth, future Queen and wartime mechanic, smiled through the weight of history. Her sister, Princess Margaret, eyes sparkling with mischief, waved like a girl reborn. It was a photograph of a nation that had survived fire, fear and famine. A royal family standing tall, seemingly whole, but it wasn't whole, not quite. Somewhere from the crowds, two figures watched the triumph in silence. Their names are left out of official accounts. Their faces were missing from the newspapers, not because they were forgotten by chance, but because they had been deliberately erased. One was Queen Victoria Eugenie of Spain, better known as Queen Ena. The other was Prince Paul of Yugoslavia. Both were royals, both were British by blood, upbringing or affection, and both had been quietly exiled, cast adrift by the very country they had once called home. Their stories, when told at all, were footnotes, yet they reveal more about power, fear and betrayal in many ways than the balcony crowd. Victoria Eugenie Julia Ena of Battenberg was born in 1887 in the shadow of Balmoral Castle, the beloved Scottish retreat of her grandmother, Queen Victoria. Her childhood unfolded within the stately walls of Kensington Palace, tea with cousins, lessons with governesses, and the constant hum of courtly duty. She was British nobility at her fingertips, daughter of Princess Beatrice, the Queen's youngest child, and granddaughter of the monarch who defined an era. As a girl, Ena was thoughtful, charming, and slightly reserved. Her match at 18 to King Alfonso XIII of Spain was seen as a triumph of diplomacy, an Anglo-Spanish alliance wrapped in the glamour of a royal wedding.
Our will and pleasure is, and we do hereby declare and ordain, that from and after the date of this warrant, our most dear niece, Princess Victoria Eugenie Julia Ena, only daughter of our most dear sister Beatrice Mary, Victoria Theodore, Princess Henry of Battenberg, shall be styled, entitled and called Her Royal Highness before her name, and such titles and appellations which to her belong in all deeds, records, instruments, or documents whatsoever, wherein she may at any time hereafter be named or described. And we do hereby authorize and empower our said most dear niece henceforth at all times to assume and use, and to be called and named by the style, title and appellation of Her Royal Highness accordingly, given at our court of St. James's the 3rd day of April 1906, in the 6th year of our reign, by His Majesty's command.
But fairy tales falter quickly under real crowns. To marry Alfonso, Ena had to convert to Catholicism, a seismic shift in Edwardian Britain, where Protestant identity was tied tightly to national pride. Her conversion provoked outrage in some quarters and whispers in others, but she made the leap, determined to honour her marriage and position. Spain greeted her with suspicion, and the palace with gossip, and worse still, tragedy followed swiftly. The haemophilia carried in Queen Victoria's bloodline appeared in Ena's children. Several of her sons inherited the disease, which caused uncontrollable bleeding and premature death. Alfonso, previously affectionate, turned cruel. He blamed Ena for the affliction, and his infidelities became public knowledge. By the 1930s, their marriage was effectively over. Ena retreated from Madrid and eventually from Spain itself. She returned to Britain in 1939, just before the outbreak of war, hoping to find comfort in the land of her birth. She still had many friends, family and connections in London society, and despite all she had endured, she believed naively perhaps that she might quietly resume life in familiar circles. Then, one summer afternoon, came the knock at the door. The visitor was Anthony Eden, Britain's poised, calculating Foreign Secretary. His message was polite in tone, but stark in substance. She must leave the country immediately. Publicly, he claimed it was for her safety. War with Germany was imminent, and the government couldn't protect her. But behind the pleasantries lay more profound suspicion. Ena, still technically Queen of Spain, and still in distant contact with her estranged husband Alfonso, was seen as a potential conduit for intelligence leaks. But there was no evidence, no charge, just the vague unease of espionage in the air. Heartbroken, Ena packed once more. She fled to Switzerland, taking refuge with friends and renting a modest villa. She wrote pleading letters to Queen Mary, George VI's formidable mother, asking to be allowed to return, but her appeals were ignored or gently rebuffed. Her home in London had been destroyed in the Blitz, and the Treasury threatened punitive taxes if she returned. Despite everything, she was treated as a foreigner, an inconvenient relic of a complicated past. Ena lived out her final years in exile, still signing letters, "Your loving cousin," still hoping, foolishly, for an invitation that never came. She died in 1969. She had never again set foot on British soil, not even to visit the place of her birth. If Ena was born into British royalty, Prince Paul of Yugoslavia had been adopted into it by wit, charm, and a fierce affection for England. He studied at Oxford, earned a reputation as a gentleman scholar, and spoke English with an upper-class accent more refined than many British cousins. He adored poetry, history, and fine tailoring, dressed in Savile Row suits, and became a fixture in royal circles. He was especially close to the Duke of Kent and George VI, then Duke of York. In 1934, his life changed in an instant. His cousin, King Alexander I of Yugoslavia, was assassinated in Marseille, and Paul, the next in line, was named regent for the underage heir, King Peter II, and it was a burdensome crown. Yugoslavia was a fragile patchwork of Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and others, bound by geography but divided by history. Paul, deeply intellectual and cautious by temperament, hoped to guide his country through the storms of European politics. When Hitler rose to power, Paul resisted aligning too closely, but he also feared dragging his people into war unprepared. He chose neutrality, walking a tightrope between Axis threats and Allied demands. To Churchill, neutrality was a weakness. Britain expected loyalty, particularly from friends. In March 1941, under immense pressure from Germany, Paul reluctantly signed the Tripartite Pact with the Axis powers. He saw it as a way to delay invasion, a gesture without real commitment. But behind the scenes, he reassured British diplomats he was still on their side. But within days, a British-backed coup ousted him. His regency was over, and German troops rolled into Yugoslavia anyway. Paul, his wife Olga, and their children were arrested by the British and sent to Kenya. Their estate was a ramshackle colonial manor, once the site of the scandalous White Mischief murder. It was a long way from the gilded halls of Oxford or Kensington, There was no trial, no defence, and British newspapers printed anonymous tips branding him a Nazi sympathiser. It wasn't true, but it stuck. Paul fell into despair. He considered taking his own life. His children grew up in the shadow of disgrace. And eventually in 1949, the British quietly allowed Paul to leave Africa, but by then the damage was done. He settled in France and Italy and refused to return to Britain and died in 1976, a man broken not by war, but by the betrayal of the country he had loved most. So could King George VI have stopped it? That's the question that lingers. He once wrote warmly to Ena, "I hope you will not be away long." He had stood at Paul's wedding. They were not strangers, they were kin. But George was a constitutional monarch, bound to the advice of ministers. And when Eden or Churchill warned that Ena and Paul were liabilities, even threats, the king had little choice but to comply. He may have smiled on the balcony, waved at the cheering crowds, and basked in victory, but somewhere, quietly, he must have grieved the absences beside him. The cost of survival not only measured in bombs and bodies, but in trust, loyalty, and the quiet exile of two people whose only real crime had been to stand on the wrong side of history's storm. On VE Day, Britain celebrated freedom, but it marked something else for Queen Ena and Prince Paul, a final, painful silence. They were erased not by accident, but by choice. They had loved the wrong people, belonged to the wrong dynasties, and held the wrong beliefs at the wrong time. Their stories didn't make it into school books, but they matter, because even royals can be exiled, and even kings at times are powerless to stop it. If you missed the opportunity at the start of this video, then here's your second chance. If you'd like to support the channel and find all my links, just scan the QR code on screen. It'll take you to Patreon, social media, and even my books. Every bit of support helps me keep making videos like this. Even a thumbs up or a comment on the video increases its chances of being seen by more people. So I really appreciate you being here, and thanks for watching.